I want to thank everyone for coming, especially early on a Saturday morning, early in student terms anyway. We had a terrific day yesterday, and I'm very excited about the day today. I'm Kate Solbaugh on the law faculty here at BU, and I will be chairing our first panel. But before I do the introductions for the first panel, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the rest of the day today. Our 9:30 panel today is going to be about education. And then at 11 o'clock, we're going to have a panel on comparative and international perspectives on the end of men with a terrific group. Then we're going to break for lunch. And lunch today is not where it was yesterday. It's not up on the 12th floor. It's in Barristers Hall, which is where we had our little reception following last night's panel. So it's in the next building, but on the ground floor of the next building. And there will be box lunches there. Then at 1:30, we're going to come back for our final panel, which should be really terrific, called Could These Both Be True? Reconciling the End of Men with Women's Continuing Inequality. That's our agenda for the day. We're going to start this morning by talking about the education and the end of men. Our panel today includes some really terrific scholars. First up is going to be Dr. Anthony Rayo, who is a psychologist. He worked for more than 20 years at the Department of Psychiatry at Children's Hospital here in Boston, and he served as an instructor at the Harvard Medical School before founding Behavioral Solutions, which is a therapy practice here in the Boston area. And he's the author in 2010 of The Way of Boys, Promoting the Social and Emotional Development of Young Boys with HarperCollins. And the next speaker after Dr. Rayo will be Carol Rivers, who is a professor of journalism at Boston University, and she's also a prolific author, journalist, media critic whose work has appeared in almost every newspaper or journal you could possibly imagine, and whose books include household names such as She Works, He Works. And she's the author in 2011 of The Truth About Girls and Boys, Confronting Toxic Stereotypes About Our Children. Our third speaker will be Rosemary Salomon, and she is the Keith Wang Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law, and she's a nationally recognized scholar in education law. She's a leading figure in the debate over public single-sex schooling, and she's authored 4 books on education law, including Same, Different, Equal, Rethinking Single-Sex Schooling. And I will be your fourth speaker. I'm at the BU School of Law. Thank you.
Good morning, one and all, and it is absolutely terrific for me to be here. Appreciate it so much, and I'm excited to be kicking off this morning with the education panel. From my perspective as a child psychologist, I'm wondering if I should think of a new title instead of The End of Men. Is it The End of Boys or Boyhood? I have a unique historical perspective. I began seeing my first cases in 1985. And sure, at that time, we saw a lot of boys referred to various clinics and places that I worked or trained at and later supervised at. But over the years, more and more boys were getting referred to us and also in our practices. And were being diagnosed more and more with all sorts of disorders. And it just became sort of a question mark, like why are more boys really appearing more in all of these mental health settings, as well as school psychology offices and counseling offices? I took a look at that, and that's what my book was about. And the national picture verifies, in fact, that boys carry the brunt of psychiatric diagnosing, as well as learning disabilities and tutoring and all sorts of support services. The national picture is really quite dramatic. 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, and those diagnoses, they really ballooned, quadrupled, in fact, in a recent 10-year period, beginning in the late 80s. They've now become the #1 pediatric problem in the United States. The 2 to 3 times more likely in boys makes it pretty much a boy disorder, but in clinic settings like in my office or in a school psychology office, we're talking probably more 7 to 8 times more boys. Bipolar diagnosing as well dramatically ballooned, 4,000% in a 10-year period beginning in the early 90s. And again, about 66% diagnosed in males, boys as well as men. So, we're talking about a really clear clinical picture that I think dovetails with what this conference is really about. So then the question is, well, what's going on? I want to talk just real briefly about where I think there are some problems with the society right now and the natural development of boys. So I'm just going to lead you through what are just three very simple, pretty much respected differences that we find in neonates between boys and girls. And anything I say, of course, there will be girls that do more of this than boys in certain circumstances, but these are sort of group differences that, when averaged, do seem to hold up. Three things that I think are really happening. The first one is eye contact. From day one, boys don't make as much eye contact as infants or neonates as girls. Listening. It turns out that boys, men in particular as well, it's true for us guys, in a certain range of hearing, it's 1,000 to 4,000 hertz, our hearing is not as acute. Now, we certainly hear, but that's an interesting sort of range because it's where speech discrimination is taking place. It may explain why, by about a year and a half, girls are about twice ahead of boys on their vocabulary, at about like 80, 90 words to about 40 or 50. And that's like starting a marathon and then halfway in starting the other group. It's an enormous amount of ground to cover. The third is motor activity, or just plain old movement. Even in utero, boys do wiggle, fidget, move more than girls, and that's a pattern that they've seen all through early childhood. So think of those three. Let's say I'm a little boy and I'm in school and I'm not looking at you and I'm not really listening to as many of the words or processing them at the same rate as, say, the girls are, and I'm not sitting still. What do teachers say all day long? Pretty much to boys. You know, let me see your eyes. You're not listening? Please sit still. I mean, I call it the perfect storm of developmental problems as soon as these little guys hit school. It's also true that the bulk of all these diagnoses I'm talking about, they're becoming earlier and earlier, more and more boys, and now they're because teachers are seeing the issues because kids are going into school, as I said earlier. So a lot of it's actually being not necessarily diagnosed, but suggested, and the evaluation process immediately gets rolling. So is that enough? Are those developmental differences right there? You know, they're not huge, but they're known. Are they enough to cause enough problems? Well, let's look at the expulsion rates in the United States, okay? What would you think would be the age group that would be the most expelled group? You'd figure it probably is boys, but you're probably thinking, you know, middle school and up, or scary gangs of kids, you know, wielding knives, or, you know, immediately that's kind of what pops to mind. It must be something very violent and over the top. The largest group of expelled students in the United States are preschoolers. And it turns out 4 to 5 times more likely boys than girls. In other words, boys, hands down, are the most likely group to be kicked out of preschool or out of all schools, mainly because they're not public, they happen to be private. But think about that. And in my office, I deal with the realities of that, where as soon as many of these little guys who aren't really listening, looking up, attending, and can't keep their motor movements still, often are tagged early and kicked out of their first learning experiences. So then I sort of want to pull the lens back and ask myself, so what's going on here? You know, is there something wrong with the Y chromosome? Is there something? No, it's not that the boys have changed over the last quarter century since I've been doing this. What are the shifts that I've been seeing? And I've been watching this both in my practice and both in the society, and we all sort of feel some of these things. So I want to just lay out maybe 2 or 3 very quickly to think about. One is, we are a society that is moving indoors. If you think about it, we're spending more and more time on electronic devices and technologies that keep us sort of banded inside. When you're outdoors, you move. We're getting less physical activity. There's no couches outside. There's no seats outside generally, unless they're hard like park benches. The outdoors invokes the body to move and to be motivated and to explore. That's not happening indoors. About 7.5 hours a day is the average that American children and teens are spending now on electronic devices, or we'll call them screens. Kaiser Family Foundation, a recent report. Boys, a little bit more than girls, and the boys in particular aren't doing the social media as much as girls are, so they're not even really interacting. They're pulled more into sort of their video gaming. There's also been a significant drop since the 1970s. One researcher points to, since sort of 1981 on, compared to pretty much in the middle part of 2000, about a 25% drop in play, about 12 hours less of free time. This is for children, American children. And the big one is 50% less of outdoor unstructured activities. Once again, thinking about those early developmental things in boys, I need to move, I need to explore, I need to touch. Sort of the idea that those types of things that may be more prominent differences in groups of boys early on are not getting met as early. That may be some of what we're seeing that happens when they enter into their school settings. Another thing I want to talk about is our cultural obsession with metrics. I see the impact on children, and boys in particular. Early on, we want to diagnose. Early on, we want to catch everything as early as possible. The problem is we're terrible at it. We don't diagnose very well in very early ranges of childhood. We think we're catching a problem. What we're doing is we're usually using not terrific measurements and observations. So what we tend to do is we look for a problem, and then we're off to the races with lots of interventions. It may explain these high rates of diagnosing in kids, particularly boys. Teaching to the test. What's very interesting, too, is we have more time in school, more sitting time in school, less recess. Why? Because of the importance of tests that do measurement, both of teacher skills and children's skills, in the educational setting. Well, guess what? One study found higher rates of ADHD being diagnosed, again, it's going to be mostly in boys, in states that had stricter test performance standards. Sports. I can't tell you how many times in my office I'll have, boys, usually around the time of middle school, just sobbing uncontrollably because why? They can't compete now in sports. If you have a son who's at a certain age level, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. The competition has gotten so severe. It's true for girls as well. But for boys, there's something very primitive that I've seen over the years where it's a really important identity to their sense of mastery, their sense of ability to compete, to be able to use competition, to feel powerful, to use their bodies. And it's a very, very big sort of heroic and also part dream of theirs to just get involved in these sports and participate. Well, you can't anymore. By middle school, the competition is so significant that most kids and boys just can't possibly do it. And it's at that point that they get cut out of the better leagues. And finally, just want to mention quickly, talk about the educational setting itself. It's a predominantly female-oriented run type of organization, if you think about it. And we can't blame women. We have to blame the men. The men aren't showing up. If you think about the number of teachers you might have had when you were younger who were male, you're probably going to be remembering more high school, or you're going to be remembering maybe middle school. 25% across the board is one statistic I've seen for males in all education. It goes down to about 9% if you look at early elementary. When you go down to preschool and K, you're probably looking at about 2 to 3% are male. And again, if you think about the importance of males in the classroom, part of the learning experience, it's more hands-on, exploratory, a lot more tolerance for movement, things like this. I personally have seen this anecdotally. A lot of parents have talked to me about it. Other clinicians have told me when boys who are more active, boys who need more sort of more rounded sorts of more multidisciplinary, multisensory types of learning, when it's a male teacher, they're a little bit more tolerant of it. Not across the board, but they tend to be. So I'm going to stop there and give it to the next person. But I want to just quickly, again, go back to that original thing to think about, which is little boys and, from what I see, the eye contact, the listening, and the motor movements. Could these, in fact, very early on be what's leading to some of the things we're seeing mushroom way down the road? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start sort of at the other end of the spectrum with education, higher education. Although one thing I might want to suggest is that there's some very interesting new research showing that mothers speak very differently to girls and to boys. There's more emotional content in mother's speech to girls and to boys, and we think that may be because now we're saying boys are not verbal, they're not naturally programmed to talk and write, and I think if we start believing that, then maybe more mothers will start giving their boys just commands and curt kind of utterances and not the rich emotional speech. So I think when we start getting into these, men can't do this and women can't do this, we have a problem. But I'm going to look really at the higher end of the spectrum. We know girls get better grades in school in every subject. They're now attending college at higher rates than boys. They earn the lion's share of master's degrees. And I think that the issue, nobody is debating the fact that girls are doing very well in education, particularly higher education. But, and here's where the journalist in me bristles at the title The End of Men, because I think this is an eyeballs framework. You look at much of there's another book called The Richer Sex, which says that women are richer than men, for which there's very little data. What we're seeing, I think, in journalism is what will get us the eyeballs. I think this is a topic that is an interesting topic, what's happening with men, what's happening with women, but the end of men? Give me a break. There is no end of men. Men have problems, women have problems, but when we put it into this, I win, you lose framework, we set up, I think, a hostility between advocates of men and advocates of women that's really very damaging. So back to the issue of how well women are doing in school. This is all wonderful, but there was a Sloan study which says that women do not do as well in the workforce as in their educational attainment. And one of the major theses of The End of Men is that Hannah Rosen argues that because women outnumber men in the college classrooms, they will replace men in the broad, striving middle class that defines society and provides leaders. I argue there is little to no data that that is happening. In fact, I think quite the opposite is happening. Women's earnings have not kept up with their gains in educational attainment. For the first time, women are half the educated labor force, and they earn the majority of degrees, but those gains have not translated into money and influence. Women are not getting to the top at anything like the rate you'd expect, given their education and early promise. It may be counterintuitive to think that education and employment don't yield the sort of money and power it does for men, but that's what's happening. Look at the stats. Female MBAs earn $4,600 less than male MBAs in their first job out of business school. Female physicians earn $39 less than male physicians. Women financial analysts taking 35% less. Women start behind and never catch up. This pattern holds true even in our most elite universities. Female Harvard graduates earn 30% less than their male counterparts. So what we're seeing is women go gangbusters, girls go gangbusters, and then they get into the real world, and the end of men is not there. Catalyst CEO Eileen Lang said in 2011, "This is our fifth report where the annual change in female leadership remained flat. If the trend line represented a patient's pulse, she'd be dead." The gains in salary women acquired over the 80s and 90s have not only leveled off, but have in fact dropped off to the point where men's salaries are again pulling far ahead. That's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So once again, we see these women getting their degrees, working hard, going into a workshop, but not taking off the way one of them would have expected, given their excellence and their success in universities. Here's some statistics that should be worrying. Catalyst looked at 13 industrial sectors. In no area of the 13 industrial sectors studied did women earn more than men. At no educational level did women earn more than men. And in none of the 22 country studies did women earn more than men. So we've seen in the past couple of years what we have called a man session, and that means the recession hit men hardest because they were in jobs such as construction that could, and other jobs that could manufacture that could be outsourced. So that again led to this idea of the end of men and how women are doing. But guess what? The new issue is the man-covery. Men are recovering much faster from the recession than women are. This situation we had in about 2008 is reversed. Women are fast becoming the big losers due to the heavy toll of the weak economy on public sector workers. National Women's Law Center says recent jobs show that public sector layoffs wiped away 45% of job gains of women over the course of the recovery. And that's where many of the high-level jobs are. State governments, federal governments, local governments, those jobs are vanishing at a fast rate. Interesting research that just came out from Yale researchers, and it shows that there is still major discrimination in our highest research universities. the Yale folks did a really interesting thing. They took a resume, and this resume wasn't of a superstar, but a good but promising candidate. And they put Jennifer's name on one, and they put Jonathan's name on the other. Guess what happened? Jonathan did 50% better than Jennifer in these major research universities. So we are still seeing that discrimination is out there. So here are these very educated women who are thinking that they're going to just sail along. But when they come into the real world, things happen. Research has found that women are hired on performance, men are hired on potential. And I just did a big survey of working women, and we got the same thing all the time. Hey, I was in this job, and I had top degrees, I had performed well, and as one woman put it, she was ready to take over when her boss was retiring because she was widely considered to be extremely competent, and he hired a 27-year-old man. And she was stunned, and she said, why? He said, well, he reminded me of myself at that age. So you find that happens a lot. There's also the phenomenon of the glass escalator, which is really interesting. We've heard of the glass cliff, where women tend to, if they're in high-level positions, they're often put in these high-level jobs when the company is failing. And it happened to people like Carly Fiorina at Hewlett-Packard. And so, of course, when the companies fail, the women fall off the glass cliff. But there's also the glass escalator. And that is that in The End of Men, Hannah Rosen suggests that cardboard men are not flexible enough to go into these new sort of, quote, female jobs like healthcare that are doing well. In fact, what the data show is that something like 1/3 of job growth among men is in these sort of female professions. But even in these female-dominated professions, men often do better than women. There's the glass escalator phenomenon finds that women and minority supervisors hire and promote white men at a much faster rate than they hire and promote women. So even in women-dominated fields, we're finding that The End of Men is a highly exaggerated. One of the things that worries me about this End of Men scenario is it's setting men and women up against each other. And there's some interesting new research showing that when men focus on women's gains in the last 30, 40 years, they tend to get anxious, they bond more with their own sex, and they feel resentful. When women look at women's gains, they're delighted. They don't bond with their own sex because they think, well, everything's fine. I don't need to be a feminist. I don't need to get together with my own sex because, everything is just fine. And then they get into the workplace and crash. They go up against that glass ceiling, and they tend to blame themselves. They go to management seminars. They look at their self-esteem. They try to get as many mentors as they can. They try to improve themselves constantly. But they don't look at the fact that there's still a great deal of discrimination out there, and just getting 27 degrees and all the particularly low-level mentors that you can get, and as many degrees as you can get, you're not going to get the job if the guy who's hiring you thinks, I want to hire somebody who reminds me of me when I was that age. So I would just like to say that The End of Men is highly exaggerated. Men have many problems in this society, but let's not put up men and women sort of against each other in a win-lose situation, because then we all win-lose.
Good morning, and I join all the other speakers who have thanked Linda McLean and the law review students and all the organizers of this conference. It's been a great 2 days, so thank you. I'm going to talk about single-sex schools, which is a topic that I've spent, I guess, about 16 years thinking about, writing about in big places and small places, a topic that I never sought out. It came to me with the opening of a school in East Harlem in New York City, and the benefactor, who was a former journalist, called me out of the blue asking for some legal advice back in 1996 because the civil liberties groups in New York City were threatening to close the school down before it opened. And so she asked me, you know, what's this thing called Title IX? And we spoke about it, and I looked into it. And I said, well, I think there's lots of wiggle room here, and I think you should go for it. Because it got me to thinking about my own days as an adolescent in an all-girls high school, which really was a definitive experience for me. I think it really made a major difference. And so I've become, in this odd way, an expert on this obscure area of the law of single-sex schooling. Now, what I'd like to focus my remarks on, and I have to compress what became a very lengthy paper that Linda McLean gently has told me I must compress to about half, into about 12 minutes or so. So I'm going to just go real quickly through this and skip over the more legal questions, because I know there are others of you in the audience who are not lawyers, and look more at the policy issues that surround the current debate over single-sex schooling and how it ties in with some of the themes we were addressing yesterday, those contextual kinds of themes as to who are we really talking about, what population of students are we talking about. And so I'm going to focus my remarks on an article that appeared in the journal Science last September in 2011, and the current organized attack against single-sex schooling that's been mounted by the American Civil Liberties Union. Now, looking at the article itself, it was signed by 8 prominent psychologists and neuroscientists, and they made 3 claims, essentially. The first, that rationale supporting single-sex schools, schooling in general, programs, based on brain differences between girls and boys lacks scientific support. And I believe this argument holds a certain amount of credibility. You know, I really do. I think there are small differences, as Dr. Rayo was talking about, between girls and boys, but they have been exploded exponentially, and I'll show you that by some brain science proponents. The second claim the article made was that there's no conclusive evidence supporting the benefits of single-sex schooling. This is technically correct. The evidence is not conclusive, but I think the statement and the dismissal of all single-sex schools based upon this argument really is misleading and overstated. And the third argument is that single-sex schools are harmful per se. Separating students on the basis of sex is harmful to students, and this is really inadequately supported in the research. The article also called for the Department of Education to rescind revisions in the Title IX regulations that were published in 2006. And in the interest of disclosure, I have to tell you that at that time, the Office for Civil Rights called me again out of the blue and asked me if I would help them draft those regulations, which I did. And most of the drafting that I put in is there. A couple of things that I wanted some more safeguards built in are not there. But so I was involved in the drafting of those regulations. Looking at the ACLU and their campaign now against single-sex schooling, in March of 2012, they officially launched a campaign called Teach Kids, Not Stereotypes. And what the Science article did was really provide scientific legitimacy, if you will, to the legal arguments that were being planned. And at that point, the ACLU was starting to bring legal action against some of the single-sex classes in co-ed schools. And I support the ACLU in some of that litigation because I think some of the practices were really very questionable. And what they did in May of 2012, they also requested public records and sent out these cease and desist letters to a number of school districts around the country. And they charged that these districts were forcing students into single-sex programs because the programs were not voluntary, relying on harmful gender stereotypes, and depriving students of equal educational opportunities. Then in August of 2012, they used some of their findings and submitted a preliminary report to the Office for Civil Rights within the Department of Education. So this is a very organized attack on single-sex schools. Quickly, the legal background, the legal claims turn on Brown versus Board of Ed, that separate is inherently unequal. Well, there's really a difference between the kind of racial segregation that was going on in those school districts in 1954 and the kind of empowerment that many of these programs, the best of them, is really trying to promote, particularly for disadvantaged students. They turn on Title IX, the federal statute that prohibits discrimination in federally funded education programs, and they turn on a Supreme Court decision in '96, U.S. versus Virginia, where the Supreme Court struck down the all-male admissions policy at the Virginia Military Institute. So these are this is the legal background for the claims. And I'm going to skip over most of the law. There were regulations in 1975 that the old Department of HEW published at that time pursuant to Title IX, and they didn't touch on single-sex schools, separate schools per se, but they did prohibit single-sex classes in co-ed schools with certain exceptions, and that became somewhat of a problem. I'm going to jump up to this new model of single-sex schooling, which came about in the Young Women's Leadership School in New York in East Harlem. That was opened in '96. In 1998, a similar kind of school was opened in Chicago, the Young Women's Leadership Charter School, based on the model of the New York school. And then we saw school districts experimenting with these single-sex classes in co-educational schools. And that's really where the problem has been mostly, and where we see the legal challenges mounted by the ACLU. Well, then in 2002, we have the No Child Left Behind Act. A provision in that law permits federal funds for innovative education programs that including same-gender schools and classrooms consistent with applicable law. And that was co-sponsored by Hillary Clinton, then Senator Hillary Clinton. She's a graduate of Wellesley College. She's a great promoter of single-sex schools, especially for girls. Even when the civil liberties groups filed a complaint back in 1996 against the New York school, the Clinton administration was in, and it was investigated. Nothing was ever really done about it. Well, in 2006 then, because of that language consistent with applicable law, the ball was thrown back into the Department of Education in Washington, and they had to do something with those old 75 regulations, and that's where we see this provision in the new regs giving school districts flexibility to establish single-sex classes in co-educational schools, so long as they're voluntary, that the treatment is even-handed, that whatever is provided to the students in the co-educational program is substantially equal. It tracks a lot of the language in the VMI decision, and I was very clear with the feds when they asked me to help them write these regs that it had to track the constitutional norms. At that time, we see arising, and I have to say hijacking the debate, this whole idea of hardwired differences between boys and girls by certain proponents of brain research, and they started giving these workshops around the United States and internationally, telling educators that there are such defined differences in the brains of boys and girls that it demands different learning styles, and it demands different kinds of teaching strategies. And the programs that really embraced the brain science research were largely the single-sex classes in the co-ed schools. The single-sex schools themselves really distanced themselves from this kind of thinking. And so we saw stories popping up in the media that was suggesting different teaching techniques. The temperature of the classroom for girls and boys was different. The color of the walls, different for boys and girls. Teachers should speak very softly to girls. They should shout at boys. And so it went on and on and on. Well, it was clear as I saw that developing, and others too, my heart sank, because I realized that these programs were really baiting litigation, and they were tainting the very good programs that I had seen, some of the schools that were cropping up in Chicago and Dallas and in New York City. And so it was not surprising then that the ACLU did mount this overall attack on single-sex schooling, again with the legitimacy of the article from Science. The article from Science, though, it really has some serious problems, and it grew tremendous legs around the globe. And so it has shaped the public debate over single-sex schooling. Yet when you look at it, it's not a meta-analysis, it's not really a study, it's just a series of kind of rapid-fire narrative of different studies from different contexts that really doesn't report fully on all the findings of any individual study itself. And so we see it relying on studies that may have very little relevance to single-sex schooling. They ignore some of the benefits that are cited in the research itself. They overlook some of the limitations that the researchers have pointed out, and they seem to confuse correlation with causation. They talk about the findings not being conclusive. Well, in education research, it's very difficult to get conclusive findings because we can't control for a lot of variables like the motivation of students, the motivation of teachers, parent involvement, the overt curriculum of the school, the hidden curriculum of the school. We can't really isolate whether it's the single-sex feature itself that's causing the different outcomes or not. And we cannot assign students randomly to treatments. In fact, under the 2006 regs, these programs have to be voluntary, so it violates the law. They look at evidence, and I want to give you just a few examples in the few minutes I have left. They look at studies, particular studies, as evidence on gender stereotyped attitudes and harmful effects. So they look at a study of the preferred playmates among 28 boys ages 4.5 to 6 over a 6.5-month period in a co-ed preschool and kindergarten. And they found that those boys who played more with boys engaged in more rough style of play. And so that's what the researchers said. And the science authors say, well, they were becoming increasingly more aggressive because they were playing more with boys and developing, negative gender attitudes as well. The researchers themselves said, they urged caution. It said it could be because this was an unstructured environment. In a structured environment, we may have seen different outcomes. The Science article doesn't mention that. They looked at a study where there were observations and interviews of preschool children over 2 weeks, where the teachers separated these children in 2 separate groups. They were co-ed groups, but in one group, the teachers used gender as a very salient feature, just pounded these kids all day long. A separate blackboard for boys and girls, girls line up here, boys line up there. The teacher would ask, I'd like a girl to give me some markers, please. So these kids were really pounded with gender all day, and they found that after 2 weeks, the children were less likely to play with children of the opposite sex. I'm not sure what you could tell after 2 weeks in this kind of pounding and gender salience. The third study, I think, is the biggest stretch, where they looked at divorce rates among men born in 1958 who attended separate schools in England, and they found that they were more likely to be divorced at the age of 42. So I guess they were concluding that if you're a divorced, and I'm sure there are some divorced men in this audience, that if you were divorced, that you really have problems relating to women. I can't understand why else they were citing this particular study, but they give no mention of the positive findings. So these are the kinds of studies, these are examples of what the Science article that was touted in the media across the globe, the kinds of studies that they were relying on without looking at other positive findings. And there were several studies from the United Kingdom, from Switzerland, from South Korea, more recent studies that the media did not cover at all. And these were studies where students were randomly assigned to single-sex and co-ed settings, and there were positive outcomes in the end. Very quickly, as Kate is reminding me, my time is almost up. I'd like to get back to the themes of this conference and the idea that context really matters. What are we talking about? Because the way this debate has evolved, it's in a very absolutist, abstract, and oversimplified kind of way. And again, it's evolving. The rest of the world is watching us as it evolves here. Number one, we have to consider, what are we talking about? Single-sex classrooms in co-ed schools, where that seems to be the most problem, or single-sex schools, freestanding schools that have a really offer a pro-academic choice, particularly for disadvantaged kids. Who are we talking about? Are we talking about rich kids or poor kids, Black, Latino, Native American kids, rural kids, inner city kids? exactly what's the population we're really talking about, and for whom might these programs be more beneficial than others. And finally, the global implications, and in the paper I discuss how in different countries, single-sex programs have evolved over a very different political and social context. For example, in some Western European countries, there's negative feelings because they're associated with the Catholic Church. In Germany, they're associated with Nazism. In third world countries, it could be the only chance that girls have for education. And so we really have to think about what the global implications of this debate that's going on here in the United States might be. And finally, moving forward, I agree with the ACLU. We have to weed out those programs that convey harmful messages of difference. I keep writing in small little places that after having worked on these regulations, that the Office for Civil Rights should be more aggressive about enforcing those regulations against some school districts. And we have to develop equally well-resourced programs that are both co-ed and single-sex so that we have some basis for comparison as to which is better for boys and girls and what population of students we're talking about. So I'll end there and invite your comments. This is not escaping.
Good morning. I'm going to talk today about the tension between the sort of boy crisis interventions that are under debate generally, including single-sex schooling, and the anti-bullying legislation that has swept the states in the past decade. A desire to reduce bullying in schools and to create safer and healthy school cultures has driven an anti-bullying movement characterized by significant reform in school programs and practices, as well as legislative reform and policy articulation around the issue in every state. While a desire to improve school outcomes for boys in particular has generated a number of programmatic proposals and responses in private and public education, most notably the public single-sex school programs that Professor Salomon was just discussing. These two recent movements in K-12 schooling spring from new urgency around each social problem, around bullying and around boys' relatively worse school outcomes. And that new urgency has shaped research questions in both cases. And I want to ask how these two movements are interacting and suggest they might be at cross purposes in some significant ways. So attempts to intervene on the boy crisis or address the boy question ordinarily begin with the ideas about boys' differences, and in particular the need to accept and support boys for who they are. Rough and tumble players with attention issues, who are non-compliant, who are competitive, and who are physically charged. In other words, attempts to intervene on the boy problem tend to honor gender stereotypes and masculinities and to approach them without judgments against boyhood that are allegedly a part of the education system. While attempts to intervene on the bullying problem begin with a really different idea, which is that gender stereotyping can be terribly dangerous to the well-being and belonging of large swaths of children who don't conform perfectly, as very few children do, to normative boy or girl behavior, and who are going to be disciplined by their peers into understanding the parameters of gender stereotypes. Children are most often bullied based on characteristics that can be understood as gender nonconformity, from the most obvious cases of bullying LGBT or questioning youth, to more subtle but nonetheless gendered characteristics like appearance or athletic ability. The best practices in anti-bullying work focus on establishing a culture of inclusion without regard to conformity, and they work to disrupt stereotype expectations. This school climate work contains, in particular, a social-emotional learning component that teaches school social competence skills. And those skills include learning to identify and communicate about feelings directly rather than channeling the experience of feelings into either aggressive or self-destructive behavior. So writ large, these interventions are about creating school cultures that don't honor stereotypic masculinities but teach nonviolent ways to stay connected within school communities. So to the extent the solution to the boy problem works to embrace or highlight or honor stereotypical boy behavior, they're in some tension with efforts to reduce bullying. And I am going to, just in the interest of time, try to skip over much of the bully crisis because I think we have some sense of it. But Michael Kimmel reduces it to a crisis of numbers, achievement, and behavior. Numbers, they drop out or expelled from school at greater rates. Achievement, they don't do as well on testing and language arts testing in particular. And behavior, they're diagnosed with behavioral disorders, emotional disturbances, ADHD. They're more suicidal than girls. They're at greater risk for both committing and being victims of violent crime. This sort of is often attributed to distinctive characteristics about boys. What I'm going to say is that that the movement towards reducing bullying in schools is creating an unwitting, as in the reformers don't have this in their minds, an unwitting shift in gender culture, that apparent crisis has led school administrators to be very, very focused on simply reducing bullying incidents however they can do so effectively. So let me talk a little bit about bullying intervention. In a little more than a decade, a completely new infrastructure has arisen in response to school bullying. The first anti-bullying legislation was passed in 1999 in response to the Columbine shootings, and today 49 states have anti-bullying laws. So over the course of a little more than a decade, every state virtually has passed an anti-bullying law, and some have come around for a second round and strengthened their laws in various ways. It's not as though this anti-bullying movement just popped up out of thin air. It drew together a lot of concerns under the umbrella of bullying. So there are some organizations, I did some work, as my colleagues know, for the launch of the Born This Way Foundation around bullying this past winter. And the Born This Way Foundation doesn't like to use the term bullying. They like to talk about youth empowerment, and they labeled their project the Kinder and Braver World Project. But in the schools discourse, this is all being called anti-bullying work. So the movements that pulled together is, a longstanding interest in youth suicide prevention and communities involved in that. Longstanding concerns about youth dropout rates, both school avoidance by targets of victims and school discipline and harmful zero tolerance policies targeting aggressors. Concerns about school violence and gun violence, hazing, generally the youth mental health community, who's very concerned about children's social emotional development. There's been a great deal of concern among identity groups, in particular gay rights organizations and disability rights organizations, and then concern about sexual harassment and Title IX. So the anti-bullying movement's new, but its component parts are not new. That's what I'm trying to suggest. But the legislation really does change incentives in schools. So let me tell you what's in the legislation. They vary by state, but they have some typical characteristics. And a number of these different characteristics channel schools towards the same goal, which is that the schools have an incentive to reduce the incidence of bullying. And they want to reduce those incidents however they can get there. So if it goes through gender stereotypes, that's going to be practically unnoticed by school administrators. So the early statutes were largely hortatory. They just encouraged schools to adopt policies, anti-bullying policies, but the later statutes tend to be more involved. So they usually contain, first, a focus on the school, not on the children. In other words, a focus on the school's responsibility for the climate and the peer ecology in the school. Second, a requirement that schools have anti-bullying policies. Third, that schools put certain things in the policies. So often identity-based characteristics, such as not having bullying on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, disability, or appearance. And when those identity characteristics have come before legislatures, they've actually been controversial at times, where the underlying project has been less controversial, which to me just reinforces the sense that legislators weren't about trying to reduce gender stereotyping in school, but they may have just produced the result. Most of these statutes have a requirement that staff report bullying to school leadership and a requirement that incidents be investigated and that consequences for bullying be stated in a policy. So they require schools to put together clearly stated expectation and processes once bullying has occurred. And it raises the salience of bullying for school leadership. They have to deal with it more directly. And that alone gives them an incentive to reduce bullying. But in addition, most of the laws also have a reporting and record-keeping requirement where they need to report to their district and to the state the number of bullying incidents a year and how they were dealt with. And that also gives them an incentive to reduce the incidence of bullying. And then finally, most of the later laws require direct bullying prevention efforts, including education efforts, educating the staff and parents about bullying dynamics, and providing bullying prevention curriculum and best practices. And often, a requirement that those bullying prevention and best practices be evidence-based. And for them to be evidence-based, they ordinarily are going to require a social curriculum. And that curriculum is going to teach certain kinds of social skills that are going to be interesting from a gender perspective. So again, it's not that it was on anyone's agenda to disrupt gender norms. It's on school administrators' agenda to reduce bullying incidents. But what happens is they have an incentive to put in place these anti-bullying curriculum, and those teach kids behaviors to avoid, don't bully, certain kinds of behaviors that will constitute bullying. But they also, the most popular and effective ones include a focus for schools on creating a positive school climate, because there's a correlation between school climate and bullying rates, and it's well established. In other words, the research on bullying now treats it as a symptom of a problematic school climate rather than evidence of problematic individual children, right? So that the programs that work to reduce the number of incidents take that frame. It's a climate problem, not a bad apples problem. And so the new anti-bullying legislation incentivizes schools to actively manage their peer ecology. So what is school climate? The inputs to school climate are generally thought of as the quality of relationships among kids and between kids and adults, and the real social norms of behavior, including the behavior around inclusiveness and feelings of belonging. And schools can move from a weaker school climate to a more positive one and reduce bullying. And in these more positive school environments, children see bullying not as a rule violation that will cause them to be disciplined, but as a violation of relationships that they care about. So the important element of achieving this positive school climate is social emotional learning programs that will improve the social competence of children. Now, the main skills taught in social curriculum are self-awareness, in other words, children's ability to identify their feelings, self-management, their ability to express their emotions constructively and not to express them destructively, skills that improve their social awareness, in other words, their empathy towards other students, and relationship skills, teaching them how to have healthy relationships based on cooperation and how to resolve interpersonal conflicts constructively, okay? So schools are energized by a number of forces, including legal forces, to reduce bullying, and they do so by teaching these skills that have some gendered components to them. So now I want to just speak quickly, I'm running out of time, about gender nonconformity and bullying. LGBT and questioning youth are overwhelmingly the more likely to be targets of bullying than are other children. But because relatively older youth self-identify as LGBT, it's a difficult topic to study during the prime bullying years, which are peak between ages 13 and 15. But researchers have developed scales of greater or lesser gender nonconformity in younger children, and they produce the unsurprising results that gender nonconforming boys are more likely to be the targets of bullying. And boys are far more likely to experience physical aggression from other boys than girls are from girls. Some research suggests that the boy who is most likely to be a continuous target of physical aggression is the boy who doesn't respond in kind to rough and tumble play and who doesn't voluntarily choose to engage in horseplay. And rough and tumble play, as we sort of have mentioned already, is widespread among boys, especially relative to girls. And some researchers focus on the idea that rough and tumble play is developmentally important for boys to learn to communicate with each other non-verbally, even though it may not teach those skills any more effectively than other kinds of play. So that's a physical communication between boys, and boys that don't like it are likely to be out of that boy language. So let me just close the loop on the policy and the curriculum as between boy culture and the anti-bullying statutes. Policies and curriculum required or incentivized by anti-bullying statutes lead to school and district audits of bullying, surveys of kids about their experience. These audits put pressure on school leadership to improve their results. Okay, some schools are just going to engage in performance compliance and not really do anything, but other schools are genuinely incentivized to succeed on this metric of reducing bullying, and they're broadening their circle as they're finding they're getting more tepid results from other kinds of interventions. So they're moving to social curriculum approach that teaches children to recognize their feelings and express them directly, and teaches them to empathize with others and to adhere to social norms that require respecting the belonging of others instead of seeking to gain advantage over others. So schools are teaching cooperation and inclusion and redirecting competitive behaviors because those schools are motivated to reduce bullying. So I hope it's clear, this point that I'm making, that as you walk through the practical stages of an evidence-based effective approach to bullying, you're going to see the unfolding of a school culture that disrupts the masculine performance of emotions, rather than celebrating it as much of the boy crisis-oriented policy would have us do. Okay, I'm out of time, so I'll close there. Thanks. Oh, so now we're going to come to the table and take questions. So the first thing I think I would like to do before we take questions from the audience, and there's someone walking around with microphones, is ask whether or not the panelists would have any questions they would like to pose to each other. As a starting point.
Right?
Yeah, go.
Okay, to Dr. Rayo. The differences that you found between boys and girls, that better? Okay. The differences that you found in your practice between boys and girls, are these, I mean, do you ascribe them to be biologically determined somewhat? I sense there's some socialization in there as well, in your thought?
A couple of things. I don't often like to go to thinking of any behaviors having any root in anything biological. Just figuring by the time that I see some behavior or some emotion expressed, even from a very young child, sometimes we'll work with kids 2.5 to 3 is a little bit on the younger side, but we'll get them around 3.5. Sometimes there's feeding problems or toileting issues or separation anxieties. Or by the time you see a behavior, you have to figure it's just the end product of some complicated factors that may have some biological roots. It's hard to avoid wanting to put them into the biological bucket, and I find myself having to stop that quite a bit. So I think the short answer to that is I don't. I see it more as sort of a social and environmental, and in particular with the family that's in the room at the time, all the dynamics going on and how they relate and their histories and everything they bring to it. Yeah.
My question is for Rosemary. This was really fascinating. And I wondered to what extent different arguments for single-sex education for girls arise as compared to single-sex education for boys, and whether or not there's any attempt to measure not just academic outcomes, but the extent to which this type of education affects gender role development. Because at least for girls, one argument that's often made, although maybe it could also be made for boys, but there's some notion that in a single-sex environment for girls, the traditional gender roles get mixed up a little more, that girls are more likely to play masculine roles in a single-sex environment because they're free to be more aggressive, and there's more gender role differentiation for girls in the context of a co-ed environment. And also, I guess, historically, if you just analogize to race, there are obviously different arguments you would put forth for, say, maintaining historically black colleges that you would not put forth for maintaining, white universities. So I just wondered if this kind of anti-subordination type thinking in the context of single-sex education registers and affects any of the data that you measure in terms of outcomes.
This new revival of single-sex schooling that we saw coming in 1996 with the East Harlem School really started. There was lots of support among women's advocates, old feminists from the 70s like myself, for single-sex schools for girls, because we thought that schools were really shortchanging girls at that time. And there was all this, and in the paper I discussed the history of this, all this literature that coming from the American Association of University Women, that schools were having a very chilling effect. They were a chilling place for girls. But even the American Association of University Women doesn't support single-sex schooling in the end. But there was this kind of anti-subordination kind of thing, that this would really empower girls. And those of us who supported the East Harlem School, that was behind our thinking. But we also wondered about African American and Latino boys in New York City as well. And there was some effort to convince perhaps a wealthy benefactor to come forward with some funds to support an all-boys school, and there was no support for a number of years. That changed. Over the years, there's now 2 Eagle Academies for young men. I believe there are 2. There's one in the Bronx for sure. I visited that school, and there's another one in one of the other boroughs for boys. And when I was writing the book, there were no single-sex schools, public schools for boys at all that I could visit. So I visited some of the very elite boys' schools in New York City because I wanted to see what we offer the most privileged. Well, maybe we could offer that to the least privileged in our society. And I was bowled over because I was a bit skeptical of boys' schools, even when I wrote the book. I was bowled over where I would see big, hulky 17-year-old manly men in the hallway, sitting on the floor, reading to little kindergartners and first graders. You wouldn't see that in a co-ed school. These schools were not teaching hypermasculinity the way I feared boys' schools would. They were teaching these boys how to be nurturing, how to be parents in some way. I would see a whole room of boys playing the violin. 7th graders. I don't think you would see that. When I visited the Eagle Academy in December, I was even more bowled over. These boys defied every negative stereotype of the African American boy, every single one. And I went into one classroom. It was a group of boys with learning disabilities, and this Hispanic boy was reading, with difficulty, but so proud of himself, not with embarrassment. He never would have done that if there were girls in that classroom. And so I've seen for myself now, I've overcome the skepticism about boys' schools, and I see what they can do, particularly for disadvantaged students.
I think one thing that in this debate, one thing that gets mixed up is quality school. We know that in any good school that has terrific teachers, low class size, all the things that make parent support, all the things that make people good, it's not really the gender that's the most essential thing, it's all these other issues. My issue with some of the single-sex schools, particularly the ones that are being pushed around the country, is that they have been set up on the models of these people that Rosemary doesn't like and I don't like, based on,
Who will go nameless today?
Who will go nameless? Yeah, Dr. Leonard Sachs is one.
We're both thinking the same too.
Exactly, Sachs and Gurian, and unfortunately,
That wasn't nameless.
they weren't nameless. No, they preach this ridiculous gospel of such extreme brain differences between boys and girls that, literally they set up girls' classrooms where everything's quiet and there's pastel on the walls, and they set up boys' classrooms where they all run around and bounce off the walls. And
with Nerf bats.
With Nerf bats. And, none of this is based on science. It's all been kind of debunked. And so my concern is that I think that, the kinds of schools that Rosemary was talking about really do have a place, in the whole scheme of things. But I do worry that so much of the single-sex movement has been a lot of this bogus junk science bought by teachers and school principals, and that's worrisome.
Go ahead.
Yeah, can I just bring it down, though, to the individual level? I'm very different from everybody, maybe even here, including the whole room. My work is purely about the anecdote. I work individually with each case that comes through the door for the hour, and This goes a little bit also to what Rosemary asked about the sort of the idea about how much of it is about in gender do you think is biological or not. We're talking about these schools as if they're homogeneous, as if same gender school is all the same here in this town and that, and they are completely different. And boys, as well as girls, in groups differ unbelievably amongst one another. Again, we talked about it earlier. The average of certain characteristics in groups is very small if you compare them across the group. Height, anything, choose your variable. The variation within the group is enormous. So when parents come to see me, and the issue comes up, particularly for boys, like should we go to one of the private schools and take them out. So for me, it's a very case-by-case basis. And I think if you're a parent, it's a whole different set of approaches that you use versus trying to look at it from more of a research and or nomothetic or large aggregated kind of way to answer this question, which is more on the policy level.
Oh, can I just ask in response to that, when you think of the case-by-case basis, how much does their gender conformity or nonconformity play a role?
It's big.
So in other words, if they're more gender conforming, you feel like they're going to fit in a boys' school better?
Depending upon the school again. I mean, I went to a co-ed school. I probably would have hated many of the all boys' schools. But depending on the school, I might have loved a few of them that now I'm seeing are cropping up today, or how some of the private schools have sort of shifted and they're offering more that are involved in the arts and music and literature and softer things versus you come in, where's your hockey stick? Here we go. I mean, they really are quite different cultures within themselves. So a lot of it's about the fit. And when you see the misfit, particularly of a boy or girl, in a public school setting where for whatever reasons, because of the cohort that particular year or who happens to be living in the town at that time, when there's a misfit, it's terrible. I also look at things developmentally. I think some stress is really good and healthy. And so I don't like the idea of also yanking kids out or recommending to parents that you start switching schools just because we're having a bad year or two. Because I think that stress, that figuring yourself out in the context of so many other people, becomes sort of a powerful sort of internal base for later on, sort of fuel for growth and development.
So I just want to say, just in response to this discussion, that in my view, and I think in the view of pretty much probably everyone in this room, gender conformity is a product of peer relations. It's not a. I mean, there are some questions about certain things that babies do or don't do, but then there's such an overwhelming wash of peer ecology that it's and I think most people think that, and so. The division of these single-sex schools and programs into ones we like and ones we don't like, for me, it's a very awkward process to try and figure out what is that supposed to mean, this ones we like and ones we don't like. I mean, it is hard to read anything about the Young Women's Leadership Academy and not feel like, wow, that's pretty impressive. But at the same time, and I think this is Carol's point, it also has all these kinds of resources and social capital around it that are extremely exciting. And a school with an idea and with energy does better than a school without an idea and without energy. And so that's why a lot of idea schools do better than non-idea schools. And it really doesn't have, that is not a gender story in particular. But it worries me, since we know that peer ecology produces gender to a large extent. It seems worrisome to me that we'd want to sort of separate good and bad in that environment. I think that should be concerning.
Just in response to your comment, I agree that the Young Women's Leadership School does have more resources. Not a lot, but they do have a college counselor, for example, that works with a small
and
number.
energy, social capital.
Yes, exactly. And it's new, it's innovative, and students go in really excited that this is going to be a great experience for them. But in writing the book, I visited the two only public single-sex schools that existed at that time in the early 2000s. The others had all closed. The Philadelphia High School for Girls and Western High School in Baltimore. Both schools that were open in the 1840s and somehow survived and remained single-sex. And I spent quite a bit of time poking around, playing fly on the wall, sitting in classrooms, talking to teachers and students and parents. And these were schools that were not particularly well-resourced. These were very big public schools with wide, cavernous hallways, very institutional, although they did have, and I write about this in the book, I wrote about it in the book, a real culture about them, a sense of history and tradition, that these girls felt they were, they were living on the shoulders of these wonderful women who came before them, but they were not well resourced. And they still had incredible outcomes. And the school, both those schools had become progressively minority over the years. When I got there, they were almost totally minority. And so I agree that some of these schools, some of them are charter schools, and the Eagle Academy too has a new building and has outside funding. But what I keep saying is, well, we really should start some comparisons with equally resourced single-sex schools and co-ed schools with similar populations to see what works, to see what really works. And unless and until we do that, we're going to keep saying, well, the findings are inconclusive and we really don't know.
I think that's true. And one concern that I have is, in this country, we tend to look for magic bullet solutions. And in some cases, it's let's just set up classrooms for girls and classrooms for boys, and that'll solve all our problems, when many of the problems are really resources, as you say. Do the kids have, huge classes? Are their parents involved? Do they have, few books and are they in socioeconomic areas where, if they don't have resources, the school's going to fail whatever it is? So I think that's right. We really have to look at what really works and what really doesn't work.
Could I also ask the rest of you, what do you think about the issue that I brought up earlier about that so few men are in these classrooms, and that we have all these boys who are coming through, and boys do react differently when they're around a male teacher versus a female teacher to some extent. Have you, like Rosemary, have you found that some of the single-gender schools that have for boys have more male teachers, for example?
Absolutely.
So how do they handle that, and what do we do about that, and do we think that's a factor?
It is a factor, but they're not totally male either. So they do have some women in these schools, and I have encouraged them not to have a totally male, because that's not the world. The world is co-ed. But they do have male teachers, particularly for this population of boys, where they really do need positive male role models. And so they see their teachers, they see their principal. These are these are really positive intellectual men who have an intellectual life, who are well educated, who wear suits and who behave in a certain way. These are incredibly good role models for these students. I think it's really important to have more males, and it's very difficult, particularly in the early grades. Yeah. But what I saw was interesting. When I visited one of the private boys' schools in the city, what I saw with little boys, which gets to some of what you're saying, and I was really struck by it. I have a son who's now 25 years old, but I remember when he was little, he had enormous energy. And I looked at these little boys, and the school was not trying to control it, as schools do. They were trying to channel it. They were channeling it in a positive way. So they had these little boys moving a little bit more than you would see in a typical classroom, but in a very orderly way, not the way Dr. Sachs or Michael Gurian would suggest, where they have Nerf bats that they're hitting and flying off the walls. This was in a very structured, kind of orderly way, but these little boys didn't have to sit still so long.
It seems to make a huge difference to the boys once they're old enough to tell me what their experience is like. What's interesting too, and again anecdotally, when kids come to see me, let's say they're in the 7, 8, 9 range, I have a swivel chair in my office, which parents think is crazy because, of course, the kids are going to run right to it, and they start to twirl around in this thing. It doesn't bother me. Moms, I know, more often feel embarrassed and keep asking their sons to just sort of sit still, not twirl, and then can you just keep your hands down? Whereas the dads seem to sort of allow a lot more latitude for that. It may be also that the moms are doing most of the discipline and are really around and doing the child rearing, so they're more responsible for the behavior in general than the dads have been. So did you see any differences, you think, among the male teachers, and also how they sort of allowed a little bit more, say, freedom of movement, or did more exploratory or hands-on play, or you mentioned some of the channeling?
Is the style different?
I think so, and I did talk to some of the teachers in the Eagle Academy when I visited that school in December. And now these are middle school going and high school students. And I asked them, well, what do you do anything that's really different? I had Dr. Sachs and Michael Gurian in the back of my head. And they said, well, we tried, our lessons are a bit shorter. And so because we realized that boys, not all boys, but many boys have a shorter attention span. And they had kind of a formula, and he explained to me, I don't quite remember, of what they would use. It's a school that is very well organized, and teachers are very well trained. And they meet together, and they really know these boys. And so he said they had some kind of a formula that they follow within each lesson that moves from, one phase to another to another.
I want to just take a minute. I would just want to, we let one or two questions come in because we're coming close to end of time. Okay. Mary Ann has been patiently waiting from the start there.
So Kate, I know you know this when you called on me, but I want to associate myself wholeheartedly with your remarks. And they actually were the basis for the question I had before you made them for Rosemary, and now the comment I have for what you just said. So Rosemary, two things. As a point of information, am I right that the Young Women's Leadership Academy has never been de jure all female? It has always been willing to accept applications from boys, and notwithstanding now LDF's great efforts, no boy has yet applied, and that no male academy has a similar issue. They are all de jure all male, and if they weren't, girls would apply. I mean, the latter you may not know, but the former you will know.
I don't know the second question.
Then the point of clarification is you talked about weeding out harmful messages of difference. And I would like to hear more from you on whether that's a limiting or a descriptive. And what is a harmful message, as Kate said, as distinguished from a non-harmful message? In particular, bearing in mind the constraints of the U.S. constitutional law, which suggests that anytime you have to say not all many, then it's a harmful message of difference. That is to say, it's a stereotype, and it should not be the basis for de jure distinctions between males and females.
It's the overbroad generalizations, and I skipped over all those PowerPoints from language within U.S. versus Virginia, the VMI case, and the majority opinion was written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who herself is not an opponent of single-sex schooling. Her own granddaughter attended one of the very wonderful schools in New York City, Brearley, but there's language in there where the court says, well, sex classifications cannot be based on overbroad generalizations about the capacities and preferences of boys and girls. But then there's other language in the decision that's somewhat supportive of single-sex schooling, as long as students are being treated even-handedly, and she even talks about diversity in educational programs, which people don't understand how much wiggle room is really in that decision. But it's the harmful gender stereotypes that some children don't conform to those stereotypes. So what about the girl who doesn't like to work collaboratively? Girls, I took a little survey of some of my female colleagues at the law school, asking them, what were you like as a kid? Did you like to work in groups? You were competitive? Everyone said, boy, I was really competitive, So, this is a very select population, of course, but what about the child who doesn't conform, or the boy who doesn't like to be competitive, who is more collaborative? What I'm saying is that these schools really should be teaching to the individual child, and not based on these group characteristics.
But I think the thing is that the level of conformity within the individual child isn't a static input. The level of conformity is largely a product of what their peer ecology has been. That's the difficulty in figuring out who is a gender-conforming and non-conforming child. We produce gender-conforming children. Sorry, Brandon Green has had his
Oh, with regard to the de jure and...
The Young Women's Leadership Academy is not now and has never been de jure all female. That is to say, will not accept an application from a boy.
My understanding, I don't want to misspeak, but my understanding is that technically they could accept an application from a boy, but no boy has ever applied. With regard to the Eagle Academy, I don't know. It's the Eagle Academy for young men.
Says it all about the point point that things coded female and feminine are so devalued that even when there's a lot of social capital attached to it, it doesn't attract.
How many parents would put an application into the Young Women's Leadership School for their son? I mean, you would only do that if you were intended to be a plaintiff in a case. Seriously, how many parents would do that?
Brandon?
Can you hear me? So, gender stereotypes aside, given what Dr. Rao said about behaviors that manifest in boys, and given sort of the overrepresentation of boys in disciplinary things in schools, and the overrepresentation of women in the teaching profession generally, is there any argument against the sort of gender-neutral disciplinary procedures or models in schools?
Oh, are you asking me, is there?
I'm asking the panel if, given the things that Dr. Rao spoke about in terms of behaviors with boys, and given what we know about how boys are overrepresented in terms of suspensions, and we know that males are underrepresented in the teaching profession generally, is there an argument against gender-neutral disciplinary procedures in K through 12 education?
It's a great question.
Yeah. It is a great question. I mean, I'm not sure how to answer it other than to say I think you're well aware that, you know, school discipline procedures fall much more heavily on boys. And I think it's why, you know, most school reformers have a lean away from zero tolerance policies and policies that lead to expulsion. I know that not all school administrators, I mean, there's a tension between school administrators and school reformers in that regard. But I mean, I have to think about whether or not there's an argument that it's a practice with a disparate impact in an important way.
Well, you know, we are also learning, like you mentioned, that rough and tumble play among boys, there are a number of male researchers who are studying this and saying that in a culture where boys aren't supposed to be emotive, rough and tumble play is the only way they can kind of, you know, they can't really hug each other, but they can, you know, sort of wrestle and do this play acting stuff that really is, when you look at it, you think it's fighting, but they say, look at their faces. When you see these little kids tumbling around and hugging each other and their faces are joyful, they're not fighting, they're not aggressive, they're finding a new way to communicate. And I think the schools have to recognize that
But it has
different
its
people
moments for
and-
some boys.
But
It has its moments for some boys. It has both moments.
It
in
has
for
both,
lives.
yeah.
But you know, I
Lynn's
just
gonna kill me, okay?
Can I just make
We're
one
way
com-
over time
make
for
one
the next
comment?
panel. Yeah.
You know, in response to your comment on rough and tumble play, then I really have to question why we have 8 prominent psychologists and neuroscientists translating that, converting this rough and tumble play as increasingly aggressive behavior. I really have to question that.
yeah, it's sort of hard to differentiate. I haven't looked at that particular study. It's hard to differentiate what they called aggression. So that's always a tough issue.
Could I also, I know we're over time, but I just wanted, I had some thoughts about that question, which I think is great. There was a school that I visited in Boston. It was a pilot program, elementary school, that had asked me in to talk with the staff because they were tracking using more traditional sorts of, as you say, more gender neutral sorts of ways of handling it. The 3 strikes, you're out, you go up to the office kind of thing. And what they were just finding was like 99, they said, we decided to look at this, 99% boys. You know, 90, 95% boys were just, you know, getting up there all the time, and whatever we were doing wasn't working. So what they decided to do is they asked, and particularly the male teachers, to sort of, could you take some of these guys and just say, look, let's say, look, you're talking out, or you did that, or, you know, you've got a lot of energy in your body. You know, why don't we channel it? Let's go out and let's run laps. You know, and this is more of an inner city school, so it's like you just go like run laps right around the building a few times, get it out of your body, come on in. And that was a really nice intervention that labeled it not as, you know, several times a day, cut it out, stop it, 3 strikes you're out, go up again, because you get into these self-fulfilling prophecies with these patterns getting great, and then these boys just end up figuring, I'm just going to show off now for attention. They end up that way, going to the principal's office, and going there doesn't do anything.
And girls need, research shows girls need this as much as boys. There's research showing that brain activity gets better after physical activity,
right,
and
and
there's no
outdoor time.
gender differences. So as we cut down recess, and as we think, well, girls can just sit there, you know, both sexes need this kind of physical activity.
So maybe not a boy issue. Okay, thank you. Terrific panel. Sorry for going over there, Linda.